It begins with the smell of dust and decay, the air heavy with the weight of time. Deep inside the crumbling remains of a Russian noble estate, a leather-bound book was discovered, its cover cracked, its pages yellowed, and its contents unlike anything one would expect to find in a family ledger. Instead of dry accounts, land records, or crop yields, the book was filled with strange testimonies, fragments of prayers, and terrifying descriptions of men and women who, according to its pages, could alter their very forms. It was written not as legend, not as folklore, but with the measured hand of someone recording fact. This was no folktale scribbled in a village hut. This was the private documentation of a bloodline that believed itself cursed, or perhaps gifted, with the ability to shapeshift. The year was 1850, and Russia was a place still caught between two worlds, one of superstition and folklore, and another of science, empire, and rigid orthodox faith. Families of nobility carried themselves with pride and power, yet behind closed doors many kept secrets too strange for polite society. What this ledger reveals is not only unsettling, it forces us to ask questions about where the boundary lies between delusion and reality, between illness and transformation, between a body that decays and one that mutates into something unrecognizable. Imagine, for a moment, finding an entry written in neat, deliberate script. On the night of February 3rd, the boy's features no longer matched his own. His eyes shifted, his voice deepened into that of another, and by morning, he returned unchanged, though weaker. Such a note reads less like metaphor and more like desperate observation. If these words are to be believed, members of this family were not simply ill, they were becoming something else, something that terrified even those who loved them. What gives this account its disturbing weight is not simply that a story was told, but that it was hidden within a family's private documents, preserved as though it were evidence. Why would an aristocratic family in Tsarist Russia risk recording such bizarre claims? What purpose did it serve to preserve these accounts of transformation? Was it a warning to future generations, a confession of sin, or perhaps a scientific record before its time? The fact that the ledger survived at all suggests it was considered important. Too important to destroy, even if its contents risked branding the family as mad, cursed, or heretical. To understand why this matters, we must think of the place shape-shifting holds in human imagination. Across cultures, transformation has always been a metaphor for danger, for the loss of control, for the hidden animal within. In Russia, the fear of the wolf, the witch, and the changeling ran deep, and to be accused of shape-shifting was often a death sentence. But here, in the cold ink of a noble's journal, we are confronted with something stranger, not accusation, but admission. Not myth, but memory. The atmosphere surrounding this ledger is chilling not only because of what it says but because of the silence around it. No public mention of this family exists in the major records of the time. Their estate appears briefly in tax rolls and property deeds, then disappears into obscurity. No descendants come forward. No lineage carries the name openly. It is as though they wish to vanish, leaving behind only this unsettling artifact, as if daring the future to remember what they endured. For the modern reader, it is easy to dismiss such writings as exaggeration or metaphor, the desperate words of people grappling with illness in an age without diagnosis. Perhaps the family faced rare genetic conditions that twisted their bodies in ways no physician of the 19th century could explain. Perhaps mental illness gave rise to visions of shifting faces and alien voices. But when read in full, the ledger does not sound like the delusions of a single person. It is written in multiple hands, spanning decades, each entry adding weight to the one before it. It speaks of inheritance, of generations touched by the same phenomenon, and of rituals and remedies attempted to control it. This is what makes the ledger so haunting. It suggests continuity, a thread of mystery running through an entire bloodline. Whether truth, illness, or superstition, it was real enough for them to record, and real enough to keep secret. As we begin this exploration, we are faced with two equally unsettling possibilities. The first, that the family truly believed in their ability to shapeshift, living in a nightmare of superstition that warped their understanding of medicine and identity. The second, that something tangible existed within their blood, something genetic or environmental that caused visible transformations, symptoms mistaken for supernatural change. Both interpretations lead us into the shadows of history, where certainty dissolves and fear takes shape. Tonight, we will step into the corridors of that forgotten estate. We will read through the fragile pages of its ledger. We will uncover the whispers of a family that believed itself cursed by nature, or by something far darker. And in doing so, we must ask ourselves a question that is as old as myth itself. What happens when a human body no longer obeys the boundaries of human form? Russia in 1850 was a land of contrasts, a sprawling empire stretching from the frozen reaches of Siberia to the shores of the Black Sea. It was a country ruled with an iron hand by Tsar Nicholas I, a man obsessed with control, discipline, and the preservation of order. His reign was marked by paranoia of rebellion, of Western influence, of ideas that might challenge the rigid structure of autocracy. Yet despite this outward display of power, the empire itself was fragile. Beneath the glittering halls of St. Petersburg and Moscow lay a population burdened with poverty, superstition, and fear. Serfdom still chained millions of peasants to the land, and knowledge was something jealously guarded, not freely shared. It was within this shadowed climate that our story unfolds. For the ordinary Russian peasant, life was marked by hardship, hunger, and tradition. The church was ever present, its rituals shaping daily life, but so too were the older beliefs, the whisper of pagan gods that never truly vanished, the fear of spirits that haunted forests, lakes, and crossroads. Superstition existed not as entertainment but as survival. To believe in werewolves or witches was not foolishness, it was caution. In a world where wolves could tear through flocks and disease could strike without warning, the line between natural disaster and supernatural curse blurred easily. A villager might pray in church on Sunday, but the same villager would whisper an incantation against the evil eye on Monday. Both practices existed side by side, often without conflict. The Russian nobility, by contrast, lived lives of relative comfort. They were educated in French literature, corresponded with European scholars, and decorated their halls with Western art. But even they were not immune to the cultural undercurrent of mysticism. A noble might attend a salon where Voltaire was discussed, then secretly pay a local mystic to ward off misfortune. Aristocratic estates, often isolated in the countryside, were perfect breeding grounds for secrecy. Behind closed doors, with servants sworn to silence, families could indulge in whatever practices or beliefs they chose. The estate where the ledger was later found would have been one such place, a grand home surrounded by endless fields, far from the scrutiny of city life, a place where strange things could happen unnoticed by the wider world. At this time, science in Russia was still struggling to take root. The Industrial Revolution had transformed much of Western Europe, but Russia lagged behind, bound by serfdom and the conservatism of its rulers. Medicine was rudimentary. Many doctors still relied on bloodletting, herbal remedies, and outdated humoral theories. The study of genetics was unheard of. Gregor Mendel had not yet published his revolutionary work on inheritance. Illnesses that disfigured the body or altered behavior were often seen as divine punishment or as the work of dark forces. To the mind of a mid-19th century Russian noble, watching a family member undergo sudden and unexplainable physical changes, shape-shifting was not a metaphor, it was the most logical explanation available. This was also a time when folklore was still a living, breathing part of Russian identity. Stories of the Volkodlak, the werewolf, circulated in rural villages. These creatures were said to walk among men by day and transform under the moon by night. Witches were believed to cast spells that altered appearance, turning men into beasts or changing their own faces to deceive. The church condemned such beliefs, but they persisted, whispered from grandmother to child. In this climate, if a family truly exhibited signs of transformation, the people around them would not question whether it was real. They would simply assume it was the work of blood, curse, or pact with dark powers. The Russia of 1850 was not just geographically vast, it was spiritually divided. Western rationalism and Eastern mysticism collided within its borders. Intellectuals in cities debated philosophy, while peasants clung to talismans and charms. Within that tension, a family could record shape-shifting in their private ledger and find no contradiction. To them, the supernatural and the natural were not opposites but layers of the same reality. This historical context matters because it allows us to understand why such a ledger could exist at all. Today, we might scoff at the idea of noblemen believing in transformation, but in their world, such belief was not only possible, it was logical. To confront the unexplainable, they reached for the frameworks they knew: folklore, superstition, and faith. Science was too limited, religion too rigid, and folklore too deeply ingrained to be ignored. So when the family at the center of our story began to write of strange transformations, they were not stepping outside the boundaries of their culture, they were reflecting them. But there is another layer of intrigue. Russia in the mid-19th century was obsessed with secrecy. Censorship was strict, rumors of revolution were ruthlessly suppressed, and the nobility often closed ranks to protect their reputations. To admit that one's family harbored something unusual was dangerous. Yet this family not only admitted it but documented it, carefully preserving the details across generations. That choice suggests that what they witnessed was too persistent, too undeniable to ignore. It was not the invention of one eccentric mind. It was a pattern, passed down, and written down despite the risks. So when we open this ledger and step into the words recorded within, we must do so with an understanding of the world that produced it. This was not modern Russia, where science might try to explain the strange. This was Tsarist Russia, where mystery was part of life itself. A world where peasants feared werewolves in the woods, nobles consulted mystics in their parlors, and a single family might truly believe that their blood carried the power, or the curse, of transformation. It is here, in this atmosphere of fear and faith, science and superstition, that the bloodline of our story lived. And it is here that their strange legacy began to take shape, hidden in ink on fragile pages, waiting to be uncovered. The ledger, fragile and worn, contains more than cryptic notes of strange transformations. It provides glimpses into the family who kept it, an aristocratic bloodline tucked away in the Russian countryside, far from the eyes of the capital. Their surname does not appear in the major chronicles of the Russian nobility. In census records and tax rolls, they are a mere footnote, a name without grandeur. Yet in their own private writing, they documented events that suggest their lives were far from ordinary. The family estate was large but isolated. Surrounded by forests and fields, it stood as a lonely symbol of wealth in a land where most of the surrounding villagers lived in wooden huts. The manor, with its tall windows and sprawling halls, would have been an impressive sight, but also a prison of sorts. In the long winters, when snow-sealed roads and silence stretched across the land, the family was left with only themselves and their secrets. Servants whispered in the kitchens, children played in shadowed corridors, and elders kept careful watch from behind curtained windows. In this environment, strangeness could fester unnoticed by the outside world. The ledger introduces us to several family members by initials only, perhaps to protect their identities even within private record. One entry refers to NP, the youngest son, described as bright but plagued by strange fevers. Another speaks of AM, the matriarch, a woman respected in the household but feared when her temper flared, her face said to contort in ways that unsettled even her servants. There is mention of cousins, aunts, and distant relatives visiting the estate, some leaving abruptly, never to return. What stands out is the recurring tone. These notes were not written with hysteria, but with solemn detail, as though the family were keeping track of something they accepted, if not understood. One chilling passage, dated 1847, describes a dinner gathering. The writer notes that the eldest daughter, identified only as E, excused herself midway through the meal. Minutes later, she returned looking different. The handwriting trembles as it records. Her eyes were not her own. The color was darker, the shape narrower, as though another person peered out from behind her skin. Yet her voice remained, insisting she felt no change at all. The event was hushed, the daughter sent upstairs, and the guests dismissed early. The entry ends abruptly. We must not speak of this again, but I will keep record. Over time, the ledger suggests a pattern. Younger family members, often in adolescence, displayed episodes of sudden physical or behavioral change. Sometimes it was fleeting. The shape of the face altered, the tone of voice shifted, or the gait of their walk seemed foreign. At other times, the changes were prolonged. There are accounts of relatives confined to their rooms for weeks, emerging gaunt, pale, or with features subtly altered. Servants whispered of strange noises echoing from locked chambers at night, of shadows moving against candlelight where no one should be. The family's neighbors, though few, seemed to sense something was amiss. One villager's tale, preserved in local folklore long after the family disappeared, described seeing a man from the estate who looked identical to a stable boy, down to his clothes, only to realize later that the stable boy had been at the manor the entire day. Such stories spread quietly, not openly accused but whispered as warnings to children. The family, aware of the gossip, withdrew further from village life. By the late 1840s, they rarely attended church or social gatherings, claiming poor health or pressing estate matters. Their isolation only deepened their mystery. The matriarch, A.M., appears often in the pages. She seems to have been the keeper of the tradition, the one who insisted on recording each occurrence. Her entries reveal a woman torn between fear and duty. In one passage, she writes, I see in them what I once saw in myself. It begins with dreams, the feeling of another inside. Then the body obeys not its owner. My mother spoke of this also. It is in the blood. I fear I have passed it to them. These words suggest that she believed the phenomenon hereditary, a curse carried through generations. Whether she was the victim of the same episodes, or whether her conviction was born of family law, remains unclear. Another figure who appears frequently is a man referred to only as V, perhaps the patriarch. His entries are colder, more clinical. He writes of his children's episodes as if recording medical symptoms. NP, again with the shifting of eyes, one brown, one pale, lasting for 2 hours. No fever, no delusion. Body otherwise strong. Recorded after dinner, extinguished by morning. His tone is detached, almost scientific, as if he sought to analyze rather than fear what was happening. Yet even in his notes, the cracks of dread show through. One chilling entry ends simply with, "If this continues, the blood will not survive another generation." The servants, too, appear in fragments of testimony. The family seemed careful not to let them know too much, yet rumors slipped through. One letter, preserved separately from the ledger but attributed to a dismissed maid, spoke of hearing growls coming from the children's quarters at night. She described seeing the reflection of a face in a mirror that did not match the person standing before it. Terrified, she left the estate and never returned. Whether her words were exaggeration or truth, they echo the same themes found in the family's own hand. What makes the story even darker is the silence surrounding the family outside of the ledger. In regional records, there are no lawsuits, no scandals, no arrests. It is as though the family carefully managed their image to the outside world, ensuring that their strange affliction, or delusion, remained locked within the walls of their home. Their disappearance from society was quiet, deliberate, almost as if they knew that secrecy was their only protection. To modern eyes, the ledger paints a portrait of a family both cursed and obsessed. They lived in fear of the transformations, yet they could not look away. They documented them meticulously, as though by writing them down they could control them, or at least understand them. Each entry, whether frantic or clinical, carries the weight of people who felt trapped by forces beyond their comprehension. This family, nameless in most of history, becomes vividly human in the faded ink of their ledger. Parents afraid for their children. Children afraid of themselves. Servants fearful of the house they served. Neighbors fearful of what lurked behind its gates. What emerges is not only the outline of a bloodline, but the haunting suggestion that they were documenting something they truly believed was real. And whether it was madness, illness, or something stranger still, it consumed their legacy entirely. The ledger leaves us with a chilling thought. This was not a single event or a passing superstition. This was a hereditary burden, acknowledged and preserved. A bloodline that may have lived and died believing that within them lay the ability, or the curse, to become something other than human. The first undeniable hints of shape-shifting appear in the earlier pages of the ledger, scattered notes written with a sense of hushed urgency. These entries stand out not only because of what they describe, but because of the consistency with which the phenomenon reappears. They are not fleeting mentions, not exaggerations or dramatic tales written for effect. Instead, they read like attempts to capture something real, something that horrified the witnesses, yet demanded to be preserved. One of the earliest entries, dated 1839, recounts the strange transformation of a young boy identified only as NP. The handwriting is firm but hurried, the letters darker where the pen pressed harder into the page. During the fever, his face altered. The jaw lengthened, his cheeks hollowed, and for a moment I did not recognize him. His voice, once childlike, spoke in tones deeper than any boy should possess. By dawn, his features had returned, though he remembered nothing. The writer, likely the father, continues by noting that the boy appeared exhausted for days afterward, as though the change had drained him of life itself. Another entry, dated just a year later, describes a girl, E, the daughter whose unsettling gaze had already disturbed dinner guests. In this account, she had been sent to her room after a fit of laughter during evening prayers. Minutes later, a servant rushed to fetch the mistress of the house, insisting that the child's reflection in the mirror was not her own. The entry records the observation with disturbing clarity. The glass showed another child, older, gaunt, with eyes like coals. Yet when we looked upon her directly, she was unchanged. The reflection alone betrayed her. The family, horrified, covered all mirrors in her room for weeks, fearing what else might be revealed. Such descriptions carry a dreadful intimacy. They are not tales from distant villages or folklore retold by travelers. They are first-hand, written by the family themselves, witnesses who are both the keepers and the victims of this strange legacy. Each record has a clinical precision, noting time, duration, and effect, as though trying to catalogue a disease. But what they describe is anything but ordinary. Villagers, too, spoke of unsettling encounters. One story, passed down orally and later written by a folklorist in the region, tells of a young nobleman from the estate seen walking through the village one cold morning. The villagers swore that his face shifted as he passed. An old woman claimed that his nose narrowed, his jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked exactly like her long-dead husband. Others dismissed it as poor light or failing eyesight, but the woman insisted until her death that what she had seen was no illusion. For the peasants, it confirmed what they already suspected, that something unnatural lurked in their household. The ledger itself reinforces these rumors. One chilling passage reads, "He entered the room as himself. He left it wearing the face of another, a cousin long deceased. We prayed, but prayer did not return him. Only sleep restored him." This disturbing detail suggests that the family members not only changed in vague ways but sometimes took on the likeness of people already known to them. Whether this was hallucination, mistaken identity, or something stranger, it deeply unsettled all who witnessed it. The accounts are not limited to physical changes. Behavior, too, seemed to shift dramatically during these episodes. The same boy, NP, is later described speaking in a foreign tongue during one of his fits. No one in the household recognized the language, but it was noted that his words flowed fluently, his voice firm, his demeanor calm. When he returned to himself, he denied ever speaking and insisted he remembered only darkness. Another entry notes that during an episode, a daughter responded to her mother with chilling coldness, addressing her not as mother but as woman, her eyes filled with what the writer called a stranger's contempt. It is here that the true horror of these accounts emerges, not merely in the physical alterations but in the unsettling sense of possession, as though another entity had stepped into the body for a time. Was this simply the language of a deeply religious family, interpreting seizures or hallucinations as demonic intrusion? Or was there truly something in their blood that shifted both body and mind? The family seemed both terrified and fascinated by these episodes. The ledger shows a pattern of careful observation. Times of day, moon cycles, illnesses, and emotional states were all noted in relation to the transformations. Several entries hint that episodes often coincided with fever, extreme emotion, or times of fasting. Others suggest that certain seasons, particularly winter, brought more frequent disturbances. The meticulousness with which these details were recorded implies that the family sought to predict or perhaps even control the episodes. And yet, alongside the clinical notes, fear bleeds through. In one entry, the matriarch scrawled, "I dare not look him in the eyes. When he speaks, I hear the voice of a stranger. I know my son is within, yet it is not him who looks back at me." Another, written by a different hand, is more resigned. "It is in us all. We may hide it, we may deny it, but the blood betrays us. We are not holy ourselves." The villagers, kept at a distance from the family, constructed their own explanations. Some believed the family had consorted with witches, trading their souls for wealth. Others whispered of a curse laid upon their ancestors by a betrayed serf or a rival noble. Still others muttered about werewolves and changelings, pointing to the similarities between the family's afflictions and the creatures of Slavic lore. Whether exaggeration or belief, these stories spread, and the family withdrew further into secrecy, their ledger their only confessional. Taken together, the accounts suggest that the idea of shape-shifting within this bloodline was not metaphorical but observed, documented, and feared. Whether the changes were real or products of illness and perception, they were powerful enough to shape the destiny of the entire family. Each entry piles upon the last, until the ledger becomes less a record and more a testimony, a desperate attempt to capture the inexplicable before it consumed them completely. In reading these words, we are confronted with the same terror that haunted those who wrote them, the fear that the face of a loved one could, at any moment, become unrecognizable, that a voice once familiar could belong suddenly to a stranger, that one's own blood could betray the boundary between self and other. The first accounts of shape-shifting do not give us answers. They give us questions, questions that ripple across generations, questions that echo through folklore and science alike. Was this madness? Was it mutation? Or was it, impossibly, something beyond the grasp of either? When we read the unsettling accounts of shape-shifting recorded in the family's ledger, it is tempting to dismiss them as pure superstition. After all, 19th century Europe was steeped in folklore, with tales of witches, werewolves, and changelings circulating through every village and manor. But behind the veil of legend, modern science gives us a framework to understand what might have been happening. These so-called transformations may not have been supernatural at all, but rather symptoms of rare and devastating medical conditions, misunderstood by frightened witnesses and reframed as evidence of something monstrous. One of the most compelling possibilities is porphyria, a genetic disorder sometimes called the vampire's disease. Porphyria affects the production of heme, a vital component of blood, leading to a range of symptoms that eerily echo the accounts in the ledger. Severe abdominal pain, neurological disturbances, and even psychosis can accompany the condition. More chillingly, certain forms of porphyria cause extreme sensitivity to sunlight. Patients exposed to even moderate amounts of light may suffer blistered, scarred skin, receding gums that give the illusion of elongated teeth, and reddish discoloration of the eyes and urine. In the candlelit rooms of a crumbling estate, such symptoms could easily be interpreted as signs of transformation. Yet porphyria alone does not explain the shifting faces and altered voices so meticulously recorded. Another contender is hypertrichosis, a condition sometimes referred to as werewolf syndrome. Hypertrichosis causes abnormal hair growth across the face and body, sometimes appearing suddenly, triggered by hormonal or genetic changes. Imagine a child who appeared normal 1 year and by adolescence began sprouting thick hair across her cheeks and forehead. In the frightened eyes of her parents, she was not simply ill, she was transforming into something other than human. It is telling that many of the ledger's accounts coincide with puberty, fevers, or illness, all of which could have triggered or worsened such conditions. Still, the medical explanations stretch even further. Neurological and psychiatric disorders may account for the possessions and changes in behavior described in the ledger. Conditions like dissociative identity disorder, DID, or severe forms of epilepsy can cause individuals to exhibit altered personalities, voices, and mannerisms, often with no memory of the episode afterward. The boy NP, who spoke fluently in an unknown tongue, may have been experiencing an epileptic seizure or a dissociative break, his mind producing speech outside of his conscious control. To his family, uneducated in the science of neurology, it would have seemed as though another being had stepped inside him. Another possibility lies in acromegaly, a hormonal disorder caused by excessive growth hormone, often due to a tumor in the pituitary gland. Acromegaly leads to gradual but dramatic changes in appearance: enlarged jaws, thickened lips, protruding brows, and hands that seem to swell into monstrous proportions. If a family member developed acromegaly slowly over years, the transformation would seem uncanny, as if the person had literally grown into another form before their loved one's eyes. When combined with mood disturbances, fatigue, and other symptoms, it could have cemented the belief that something unnatural was at work. Medical science also considers psychogenic illness, when fear and suggestion cause multiple people to experience or interpret symptoms in the same way. In isolated aristocratic families, where rumors of curses and strange legacies ran unchecked, it is possible that ordinary ailments were filtered through a lens of superstition. A fever-induced delirium might appear as shape-shifting. A fit of laughter at prayers could be seen as possession. A reflection in the mirror distorted by candlelight might convince an entire household that the child before them was not their own. Once the idea of transformation took root, every unexplained symptom became evidence, every deviation proof of the family's curse. Still, even medical reasoning cannot fully dissolve the chill of the accounts. One detail that resurfaces repeatedly is the temporary nature of the changes. Many entries describe the afflicted returning to normal by dawn, their memories erased. This does not align neatly with porphyria or acromegaly, which are chronic and progressive conditions. Instead, it points us toward episodic illnesses such as epilepsy or psychotic breaks. Epileptic seizures, particularly temporal lobe epilepsy, can alter facial expressions dramatically, cause vocal distortions, and leave the sufferer exhausted and confused afterward. To onlookers, it could appear as though the victim had worn another face, spoken with another voice, only to collapse back into themselves when the fit ended. The question then becomes, why this family, and why so consistently? One explanation is genetics. Isolated noble families, particularly in Europe, were notorious for intermarriage, keeping wealth and land within their bloodline but also concentrating hereditary illnesses. Porphyria, hypertrichosis, and epilepsy are all conditions that can run in families, passed silently from one generation to the next. What the villagers whispered of as a curse may in fact have been the product of centuries of genetic entanglement. The blood itself betrayed them, not through magic, but through the relentless logic of inheritance. And yet, the psychological impact of these episodes cannot be underestimated. Imagine growing up in such a household, where every cough, every fever, every strange look in the mirror was scrutinized for signs of transformation. Children raised in fear of their own blood may have internalized the belief that they were destined to change, destined to become monsters. Such belief can shape behavior, manifesting in psychosomatic symptoms, hysteria, or what is now understood as somatic conversion disorder. In this way, the science of the body collides with the power of the mind, creating a cycle of expectation and confirmation that reinforced the family's legend. Modern researchers examining similar historical cases often tread carefully. They recognize the temptation to retroactively diagnose, to impose medical categories onto stories that were never written as case files. But they also acknowledge that what seems like myth often has its roots in very real suffering. The family who filled their ledger with trembling accounts of shapeshifting were not inventing stories to entertain. They were documenting horrors they believed they saw, horrors that shaped their lives and reputations. Whether through Porphyria's blistered skin, hypertrichosis unnatural hair growth, epilepsy seizures, or the cruel progression of acromegaly, their bodies betrayed them in ways that felt alien, supernatural, and terrifying. And so, the science of transformation does not destroy the legend, it deepens it. For what is more frightening, a curse passed down through bloodlines, or a genetic illness twisting its victims into shadows of themselves, a demon speaking through a child's mouth, or a seizure that robs him of identity and memory alike? The line between folklore and pathology is thinner than we like to admit, and in that liminal space, the legend of the shifting family survives. If the villagers whispered of werewolves and witches, they were not entirely wrong. The science tells us that bodies can change, that faces can betray their owners, that bloodlines can carry silent dooms. Whether through mutation, inheritance, or madness, the family's transformations were real enough to scar generations. And sometimes, science can explain the horror, but it cannot make it any less terrifying. Among the many entries in the forgotten ledger, one theme emerges again and again, the sense that whatever afflicted this family was not random, but inevitable. Illnesses, distortions, and episodes of strange transformations seem to pass from parent to child as reliably as wealth and title. To the villagers who lived under the shadow of the estate, the explanation was simple: this family was cursed. A blight had seeped into their blood generations before, and no ritual, prayer, or marriage alliance could wash it away. The idea of a hereditary curse was not unusual in the Russia of the mid-1800s. Folklore brimmed with stories of bloodlines doomed by pacts, punishments, or unbroken sins. But in this family's case, whispers of inbreeding and visible hereditary disorders made the myth disturbingly plausible. To understand how the notion of a bloodline curse took root, one must consider the customs of Russian nobility in the 19th century. Families often intermarried within small circles, consolidating estates and preserving dynastic power. While this practice secured wealth, it also concentrated genetic vulnerabilities. Rare conditions that might have remained hidden in broader populations surfaced with disturbing frequency in tightly bound bloodlines. Epilepsy, mental illness, deformities, and even stillbirths were more common in these aristocratic circles, yet were rarely spoken of in open terms. Instead, such afflictions were cloaked in euphemism, hidden away in monasteries, or explained as divine judgment. When a family became known for repeated tragedies, the story of a curse was easier to tell than the truth of inheritance. The ledger reinforces this perception. Several entries note how a child's strange behaviors or physical changes mirrored those of an earlier ancestor. In one haunting example, a daughter who suffered recurring night terrors was compared to a great-aunt remembered for speaking in voices not her own. Another entry recalls how two cousins, years apart, both developed sudden facial hair growth that seemed unnatural in girls of their age. To the family, these parallels were evidence of destiny. To modern eyes, they are the fingerprints of recessive genes expressing themselves again and again in a dwindling pool of blood. The sense of doom was heightened by the family's own secrecy. Noble households often went to great lengths to conceal unfit heirs, either locking them away in remote wings of the estate or sending them to distant monasteries under the guise of piety. The more a family tried to hide its flaws, the more the surrounding villagers speculated. And speculation in rural Russia was fertile ground. Orthodox Christianity dominated official belief, but beneath it pulsed centuries of pagan superstition. Illness was not just a matter of the body, it was a matter of the soul. To suffer repeatedly across generations meant the family had offended God, or worse, made some pact with darker forces. In such an atmosphere, each birth was a gamble. Parents approached the cradle with both love and fear, watching for the first signs of strangeness. Was the child's cry too shrill? Did the infant's skin blister too easily in sunlight? Did the toddler wake at night with unnatural strength or speak words they could not possibly know? In households burdened by memory, even ordinary childhood behavior might be misread as a herald of transformation. This cycle of expectation likely became self-fulfilling. Believing themselves cursed, the family may have seen illness where there was only fever, madness where there was only grief. In their desperation to explain the unexplainable, they wrote their doom into the blood. But superstition was not the only lens through which the curse was understood. Even in the mid-1800s, science was beginning to recognize hereditary transmission of disease. Physicians studying noble families across Europe noted that certain taints appeared repeatedly in lineages: epilepsy in the Habsburgs, hemophilia in the Romanovs. In Russia, physicians often framed these as degenerations of the blood. Such terminology only reinforced the mystical language of curses. What villagers whispered as witchcraft, doctors confirmed with cold clinical detachment: the family line was corrupted. This blending of science and superstition created a uniquely frightening narrative. The curse was not only spiritual but biological. It lived in the very marrow of the family's descendants, as inescapable as eye color or height. The fear of inescapable heredity rippled beyond the household itself. Other noble families, wary of tainting their own lines, sometimes refused marriage proposals from those marked with rumors of curses. In a society where alliances determined power, this was a devastating blow. The afflicted family became increasingly isolated, forced to marry cousins or distant relatives within their own circle, which in turn intensified the very genetic vulnerabilities that fueled the stories. In this way, the curse was self-perpetuating. Social stigma ensured isolation. Isolation deepened hereditary illness. Illness confirmed the existence of the curse. This cycle was devastating not only biologically but psychologically. To grow up under the belief that one's fate was sealed by ancestry is a crushing burden. Children raised in such families often developed a fatalism that bled into every decision. Why strive for glory if your blood betrays you? Why seek love if your touch carries a curse? Some entries in the ledger suggest exactly this kind of despair. A young heir, upon turning 18, wrote that he dared not take a wife, lest my issue become based. His words echo the terror of inheritance, the sense that desire itself was dangerous, that even the act of continuing the family line was an act of cruelty. The bloodline curse also provided a convenient explanation for tragedy. Miscarriages, infant deaths, sudden illness, each of these might have natural causes, but within the framework of a cursed family, they were inevitable. This belief created a lens through which every misfortune, no matter how ordinary, was magnified into evidence. The more the family suffered, the more certain they became of their doom. It is no wonder they recorded their experiences with such meticulous detail. The ledger was not simply a diary, it was a map of fate, proof that their suffering was written long before they were born. In the end, whether through inbreeding, genetic disorder, or psychological conditioning, the idea of a curse held power because it felt true. The family's children did change, their bodies did betray them, their minds did fracture. The villagers saw it, the parents lived it, and the ledger preserved it. Science today may offer explanations, but in their world, explanation mattered less than inevitability. They were cursed, not because of demons or pacts, but because every morning, when they looked into the faces of their kin, they saw their past and their future collapsing into the same haunted blood. For all the rumors whispered through villages and parishes, nothing is as tangible or unnerving as the family ledger itself. Bound in worn leather, its edges cracked from damp and time, it is a book that should not have survived. And yet it did, hidden for decades in a false compartment of the estate library, shielded from sunlight and from prying eyes. If not for its discovery during renovations in the early 20th century, the strange history of this family might have remained sealed in folklore. Instead, the ledger offers us a window into the private terrors of a lineage that believed themselves cursed. The physical condition of the ledger tells its own story. The handwriting shifts across generations. Neat, disciplined Cyrillic script in iron gall ink at first, giving way to shakier, hurried notations, sometimes smudged as if written in a trembling hand. Margins are filled with small sketches, faces half-finished, limbs distorted, and symbols that echo both Christian crosses and older pagan marks. Some entries are meticulously dated, while others trail off mid-sentence, as if interrupted by some urgent event. One section is written in a cipher, a code only partially cracked by later historians, suggesting there were details the family did not want even their own descendants to understand easily. The content itself is deeply unsettling. Some entries read like clinical observations, describing symptoms with the detachment of a physician. At dawn, skin mottled and pale, gums drawn back further, voice low and unrecognizable. Others, however, slip into the language of fear and desperation. God preserve us, for the child wears another's face in the mirror. The ledger oscillates between cold observation and raw terror, creating a rhythm that mirrors the family's own oscillation between rationality and superstition. Particularly disturbing are the recurring symbols. Several entries are marked with an elongated X, drawn across the page, followed by blank lines, as if the writer intended to say more but could not bring themselves to continue. Some pages are missing entirely, torn out with jagged precision. Historians have speculated whether these were acts of censorship, an attempt by later generations to conceal the most damning evidence, or whether the missing pages were deliberately removed and hidden elsewhere. The gaps themselves create a haunting silence, as though secrets too dangerous for even a cursed bloodline were stripped from the record. The question arises, why would the family record these horrors at all? The answer may lie in the dual role of the ledger. On one level, it was a private diary, a place where generations could bear witness to their suffering and seek patterns in their fate. On another, it functioned as a legal and spiritual document. In Orthodox Russia, written testimony carried power. To write something down was to fix it, to prove it existed. By documenting each transformation, each madness, each death, the family may have believed they were not only preserving knowledge but also creating a record for divine judgment. If they could not escape the curse, perhaps their descendants could understand it, and perhaps God himself would see their innocence. There are also hints that the ledger was used as a diagnostic tool. Several entries reference earlier cases, as with AP, the boy's eyes shifted in hue after the fit. These comparisons suggest the family sought to track the recurrence of symptoms across generations, almost like primitive geneticists. They were cataloging their curse, searching for a pattern that might one day reveal its cause. That such a project ended only in despair speaks volumes about how little they understood, and how overwhelming the phenomena seemed. Equally fascinating is the question of who was entrusted to write in the ledger. While the earliest sections seemed dominated by patriarchs, heads of the family preserving their authority, later entries bear the marks of mothers, sisters, and governesses. The shift is telling. As the men of the household often distanced themselves from afflicted children, sending them away to monasteries or rural retreats, the women remained as witnesses. Their writing carries a rawness, a kind of desperate intimacy, that the men's entries lack. In their hands, the ledger ceases to be merely a record and becomes a confession, a cry for help that would never be answered. Perhaps the most chilling detail is how deliberately the ledger was hidden. When discovered, it was wrapped in cloth, sealed behind a panel of oak. Dust and insect damage suggest it had lain untouched for at least half a century. Why hide it? Some argue the family feared scandal, that the contents, if exposed, would destroy their already fragile reputation. Others suggest the book itself was seen as dangerous, imbued with the same curse it described. In Russian folklore, objects can carry contagion of the spirit. To preserve the ledger was to preserve the curse. To hide it was both an act of shame and of self-preservation. And yet, the book survived when so much else was lost. The estate itself crumbled after the Russian Revolution, its treasures scattered or burned. Servants fled, descendants vanished into exile or anonymity. But the ledger remained. Its survival feels almost intentional, as though some unseen hand ensured that the story of the shifting family would not be forgotten. The fact that it was hidden in a library, a place of memory and learning, only sharpens the irony. The family could not control their blood, but they could control their story, at least long enough to pass it into the shadows of history. Now, as researchers pore over its pages, we are left with the uncomfortable realization that this was never meant for our eyes. These were private horrors, meant to be confined within walls that no longer stand. By reading them, we resurrect voices that wanted only to be silenced. And perhaps, in doing so, we risk inviting the same fate the family tried so desperately to contain. If the ledger as a whole chills with its whispers and omissions, then its most detailed transformation accounts freeze the blood. These are not vague references to strange illnesses or ominous symptoms. They are full, harrowing narratives, written as if the authors themselves needed to bear witness, to carve the horror into permanence. Reading them today, one senses the desperation of people who could not believe their own eyes and yet felt compelled to record exactly what they saw. One of the earliest detailed accounts dates to the spring of 1824. A daughter, aged 12, was said to have awoken in the middle of the night screaming. Her mother, writing the entry, describes rushing to the girl's chamber and finding her standing upon the bed, hands clawed, face distorted as though another spirit wore it. The girl's eyes were recorded as having shifted in hue, from the pale blue of morning to a shade dark as coal. She growled rather than spoke, knocking over a candle before collapsing back onto the mattress. By morning she claimed to remember nothing. Her mother adds in a trembling note, "It was as if she had been borrowed by another presence. My child was there, yet not." A generation later, in 1841, another entry describes a boy of 17 who returned from an afternoon hunt with the gait of a man twice his age. His skin, pale and stretched, seemed to sag from his jaw, and his voice was deepened into something his father did not recognize. For several hours he sat in silence, refusing to eat or speak, before suddenly rising and speaking in a tongue unknown. Servants swore the sounds were not Russian nor any language they had heard, but closer to the chanting of pagan priests. The account ends with the line, "When the priest arrived, he was as himself again, though ashamed, and asked us why we had summoned him." Perhaps the most terrifying passage is from 1852. A governess records the episode of a young boy, only 9 years old, who seemed to change before her eyes during morning prayers. She describes his lips curling back, revealing teeth that appeared elongated. His posture bent, his hands stiffened, and his eyes flashed the color of blood. The governess claimed the boy spoke her name in a guttural voice that did not belong to him, repeating it until she fainted. When she awoke, the boy was weeping in the corner, frightened by her screams. The family dismissed the event as hysteria, but the governess insisted she had witnessed a metamorphosis, however brief. She continued to write in the ledger even after being dismissed from her position, as though compelled to warn whoever might one day read it. Not all entries are so dramatic, but their subtlety is no less unnerving. In 1837, a mother writes of her infant daughter whose skin shifted color like the surface of water when the sun moves behind a cloud. She describes blotches appearing and disappearing within moments, so quickly that she doubted her own vision. When she called for others, the child appeared normal, but the episode returned again and again in private. "I cannot prove what I see," she wrote, "yet I know I am not mad." This quiet insistence is almost more haunting than the violent accounts, suggesting that transformation was not always dramatic, but sometimes insidious, a creeping change only the closest eyes could see. One striking pattern emerges across the ledger. These transformations often occurred at liminal times, at night, at dawn, during illness, or at moments of heightened emotion. This detail reflects the deep folkloric association between thresholds and danger. Just as midnight was said to belong to spirits, so too did moments of transition, between sleep and waking, between sickness and recovery, between childhood and adolescence. It was at these boundaries that the family seemed to blur, their identities slipping out of human shape and into something uncanny. The accounts also emphasize mirrors. In several entries, the afflicted was said to look different only in reflection. A boy whose face appeared unchanged to his father was described as monstrously twisted when seen in a mirror's glass. A daughter, weeping at her dressing table, claimed her reflection moved when she did not. These episodes align disturbingly well with symptoms of epilepsy and hallucination, but within the cultural context of 19th century Russia, they carried supernatural weight. Mirrors were long believed to be portals for spirits, capable of revealing truths hidden from the human eye. That the family's ledger repeatedly links mirrors to transformation is no coincidence. It symbolized the fear that their own identities were unstable, that their true forms lurked just beyond the surface. In reading these accounts, one must also note the meticulous detail given to physical features: teeth, eyes, hands, skin. These were the markers of identity, the outward signs of self. That these features were described as shifting, elongating, or darkening reflects a deep terror of bodily betrayal. To watch a loved one's face warp into something unrecognizable is perhaps one of the most primal fears we hold. Whether through illness or hallucination, the family saw their kin not as themselves, but as others. And each time it happened, Their belief in the curse grew stronger. Even more unsettling are the silences between the lines. In some entries, a transformation is described in detail, but no aftermath is recorded. Did the family dismiss it, erase it, or did the witness fear writing more? In one particularly fragmented passage, the writer simply notes, "He was not himself. We locked the door." Nothing follows, as if the act of confinement was too shameful or too frightening to describe. Such omissions raise more questions than answers, and perhaps that is their truest horror, that some events were too much even for those who believe themselves cursed to write down. The transformation accounts reveal more than physical or psychological symptoms. They reveal a family that saw itself unraveling. Each episode was another thread pulled from the fabric of identity, until they no longer knew where humanity ended and monstrosity began. Whether real or imagined, these transformations were experienced as truth, lived with the same weight as any disease or affliction. And in the isolation of their estate, with no one to challenge or explain what they saw, truth and terror became indistinguishable. Even now, centuries later, the descriptions linger in the imagination. A girl standing on her bed with coal dark eyes. A boy chanting in an unknown tongue. A child's reflection moving when she did not. These images remain as alive on the page as they must have been in the candlelit halls of the estate. They are not the stuff of folklore retold by outsiders. They are direct voices from within the cursed bloodline itself. And whether we interpret them as evidence of illness, mass hysteria, or something inexplicable, they compel us to ask a single, haunting question. What exactly did these people see? If the family's own accounts in the ledger were chilling, then the testimonies of outsiders deepen the unease. Servants, priests, and villagers who encountered the so-called cursed bloodline left behind fragments of testimony that, when pieced together, reveal how these transformations were perceived by those beyond the estate's walls. Unlike the family's confessions, which often teeter between medical and supernatural explanations, the witnesses tended to frame what they saw in stark, uncompromising terms, either as evidence of unholy interference or as proof that madness and degeneracy were rotting the family from within. One of the earliest surviving witness statements comes from a servant named Elena, written in 1826 during a dispute over wages. Among her complaints, she includes a chilling aside. The boy, he was changing. I saw his face turn shadowed though the candle did not flicker. I swear on my mother, it was no trick of light. His teeth were sharp, too many in his mouth. When I screamed, the lady struck me for blasphemy. Though her account was buried in a court record about unpaid labor, its detail stands out. It suggests that even those considered lowborn and easily dismissed noticed, and feared, the same uncanny shifts the family recorded in the private ledger. In 1832, a traveling priest named Father Nikolai visited the estate after reports of strange disturbances. His diary, later preserved in a monastery archive, records the following: "The eldest son was brought to me. His eyes rolled as if seized by fits, yet his limbs moved with unnatural strength. When I prayed, he spat upon the cross and spoke in words my ears knew not. The mother wept and begged me to bless the boy's chamber, not the boy himself. This request struck me deeply. It was as though they believed the space, not the soul, was tainted." The priest's words highlight an uncomfortable truth. Even clergy who encountered the family firsthand often left more questions than answers, torn between diagnosing possession and recognizing the possibility of hereditary madness. Villagers, too, whispered their stories. Oral accounts gathered decades later in ethnographic surveys describe how peasants avoided working on the estate grounds after dusk. One such testimony, collected in the 1870s, recalls, "We heard the young master laugh in the night, but it was not laughter as a man makes, it was like the howl of a dog. The windows shone with fire though no lamps burned. We kept our distance, for to see him was to invite sickness." Though the details are vague, the tone of dread is unmistakable. For the villagers, the family's affliction blurred seamlessly with the supernatural folklore of the Russian countryside. Werewolves, revenants, and cursed nobles were part of their collective imagination, and the strange events at the estate confirmed, rather than challenged, those beliefs. More troubling still are the testimonies of medical attendants brought in during the mid-19th century. A physician named Dr. Lobanov, summoned in 1855, later wrote a private letter describing his visit. The patient, a youth of 15, displayed violent contortions and a temporary alteration of facial aspect which I can only describe as grotesque. His mother insisted it was a passing spell. I feared epilepsy, though the extremity of the distortion gave me pause. It seemed less disease than masquerade, as though his body imitated another form. The doctor's words bridge the rational and the uncanny. Trained to diagnose, he nonetheless falters, grasping for language that hints at possession or transformation. Even casual visitors notice something. A tutor hired from Moscow in the 1860s wrote that he stayed only 3 months before resigning. In a letter to his brother he confided, "At supper, the youngest daughter gazed upon me so fixedly that her pupils seemed to consume her eyes. I thought her struck by fever, but when I blinked, her eyes were normal again. I cannot live in a place where reality changes between one breath and the next." This testimony suggests that encounters with the family produced not only fear but also profound disorientation, as if the boundaries between perception and reality frayed around them. The servants' testimonies are perhaps the most numerous, though often the most fragmented. Many were recorded years later in taverns or court hearings, usually dismissed as gossip. Yet their consistency is haunting. Time and again, they describe sounds that did not belong to human throats, faces that altered and then returned to normal, and an atmosphere of suffocating dread within the house. One particularly evocative account comes from a maid named Daria, who claimed, "I saw the mistress herself stand before the mirror, but the reflection showed her back, not her face. She covered the glass at once and told me never to speak of it. I left the house that very night." These testimonies are vital not only for their eerie detail, but for how they reveal the family's relationship with outsiders. Again and again, servants were silenced, dismissed, or punished for speaking of what they saw. Priests were summoned reluctantly, and often only after the family had attempted to conceal the transformations. Doctors were called in, but their conclusions were buried or ignored. It seems the family oscillated between secrecy and desperate appeals for help, never able to decide whether their affliction was a medical problem, a spiritual curse, or something worse. Scholars who later studied these accounts noted the striking interplay between cultural expectation and lived experience. For villagers steeped in folklore, the family's afflictions proved the reality of curses and shapeshifters. For priests, they confirmed the ever-present threat of demonic interference. For doctors, they provided confounding symptoms that resisted classification. And for servants, they represented terror too intimate to be dismissed, a nightmare they lived with daily, trapped within the same walls as their masters. Together, the witness testimonies create a kind of echo chamber around the family's own ledger. They confirm, amplify, and distort the events described within it, but they never contradict them. Instead, they form a chorus of fear and fascination, each perspective colored by the witness's role and beliefs. If the ledger was the family's attempt to record their curse for posterity, the testimonies are the world's reflection back upon them, a reminder that their horror could not be contained within the estate. Perhaps most unsettling is the way these testimonies linger in the historical record, long after the estate itself fell into ruin. The family may have tried to control their narrative, writing carefully in the ledger, but the voices of outsiders slipped free, scattered through archives, court records, folklore collections, and private letters. And it is these scattered fragments, coming from so many different directions, that give the curse its staying power. It is one thing for a family to record its own madness. It is another for strangers, unconnected by blood or interest, to report seeing the same horrors. The result is an unnerving mosaic of observation, each shard incomplete, but together forming a picture of a family caught in the grip of something inexplicable. Whether illness, possession, or imagination, the witnesses saw enough to believe. And their voices remind us that sometimes the most terrifying truths are those that cannot be confined to the margins of a single book. The ledger entries and the witness testimonies converge into a disturbing chorus of claims that seem impossible to ignore. Yet the lingering question remains, what, exactly, was happening to this family? Were these reports of shape-shifting transformations evidence of an undiagnosed hereditary illness, or were they, as many contemporaries believed, signs of supernatural corruption? To approach this question, one must explore how 19th century Russia understood the body, the mind, and the soul, and how modern science would later reinterpret such cases. In the medical sphere of the 1800s, the most common framework for strange bodily symptoms was rooted in neurology and what physicians then called nervous disorders. Epilepsy, in particular, carried immense stigma and misunderstanding. Attacks of sudden convulsions, altered facial expressions, guttural sounds, and violent spasms could all be mistaken for possession or transformation. Some scholars suggest that the descriptions of the family's contortions, twisted limbs, eyes rolling back, unearthly howls, might represent epileptic seizures, perhaps passed down genetically. Families plagued with recurring seizures often faced whispers of curses, since the disease was poorly understood and terrifying to witness. Another possible explanation is a genetic disorder such as hypertrichosis, excessive hair growth, or porphyria, which can produce bizarre and unsettling symptoms including discoloration of the skin, heightened sensitivity to light, and severe abdominal and nervous system issues. In folklore, sufferers of porphyria were sometimes described as vampires or shapeshifters, since their symptoms created a visible otherness. The idea that this Russian bloodline carried a rare genetic condition would align with the family's insular marriage practices, which increased the likelihood of hereditary disorders manifesting across generations. Psychiatric explanations, though less advanced at the time, also cannot be ignored. The 19th century saw the rise of diagnoses like hysteria, melancholia, and what would later become known as schizophrenia. Hallucinations, dissociation, and sudden changes in behavior were easily interpreted through a supernatural lens in rural Russia. If a family member screamed, laughed uncontrollably, or seemed to slip into another identity, neighbors could hardly resist concluding that they had seen a transformation into something inhuman. In this sense, the shape-shifting might have been less a physical metamorphosis and more a psychological one, shifts of personality and perception mistaken for literal changes in form. And yet, purely medical explanations often fall short. Too many witnesses, too many overlapping accounts, describe not only behavior but physical alteration, faces lengthening, eyes shifting color, even voices echoing with animal tones. For believers in the supernatural, these were not signs of epilepsy or madness, but of possession or witchcraft. The Orthodox Church in Russia maintained a strong belief in the reality of demonic interference. Priests trained in the rite of exorcism were taught to recognize when a human body was commandeered by a spirit. The accounts of the family spitting on crucifixes, speaking in unknown languages, or recoiling from icons all supported this interpretation. To them, the bloodline was less diseased than it was spiritually corrupted, perhaps by a pact made generations before. Folklore scholars have pointed out the striking parallels between the Ledgers accounts and Russia's rich tradition of shape-shifting myths. Werewolves, or volkodlak, appeared frequently in Eastern European legend, often described as nobles cursed for cruelty or betrayal. Vampiric figures also loomed large in Slavic mythology, with the idea that families could be plagued by revenants who returned generation after generation. The description of laughter-like howling, the transformation of eyes, the aversion to religious symbols, all these resonate with the archetype of the cursed noble line haunted by ancestral sin. It is also important to consider the psychological environment of the estate itself. Isolation, secrecy, and intermarriage created a pressure cooker atmosphere where suggestion and belief could amplify real symptoms into something greater. A convulsion seen by one family member might be retold as a half-human transformation, fueling an atmosphere of dread that shaped every perception. Servants raised in a culture of folklore would interpret every strange incident through the lens of werewolves and demons. Priests saw evidence of Satan at work. Doctors struggled to apply rational frameworks but often described events in language that betrayed their unease. In such a setting, the line between observation and interpretation blurred until it was nearly impossible to separate fact from perception. Modern geneticists looking back have speculated whether a combination of disorders could explain the curse. A hereditary neurological illness producing seizures, paired with a condition like porphyria, might indeed create physical changes and terrifying displays. Combined with the psychological toll of living in a family convinced of its own curse, these illnesses could give rise to the enduring legend of shape-shifting. Yet even with modern tools, certainty eludes us. No tissue samples survive, and the ledger provides description but not diagnosis. The supernatural explanation, while less scientific, endures precisely because it speaks to the deep fear people hold about losing control over their own bodies and identities. The idea that blood itself can be tainted, that transformation lies dormant in the veins waiting to erupt, is a theme far older than medical science. It is myth made flesh, and in the Russian countryside of the 1800s, myth was often as persuasive as fact. Thus, the family stood at a crossroads of interpretation: disease or demon, madness or curse. Their ledger recorded the experiences faithfully, but left the judgment to posterity. Were they chronicling a hereditary illness long before science could name it? Or were they confessing to a legacy of corruption that defied earthly explanation? The witnesses, the doctors, the priests, all offered their theories. None resolved the mystery. Perhaps that is why the story endures. Explanations can be proposed, symptoms can be catalogued, but the weight of the unknown remains. The ledger whispers of transformations that no diagnosis can fully contain. And whether one sees them as the marks of a rare disorder or the hand of the supernatural, the effect is the same: a family consumed by forces beyond their control, leaving behind only fragments of truth for us to piece together. By the mid to late 19th century, the once prominent Russian family that had been chronicled in the ledger was no longer a force to be reckoned with. Their estates, though grand in architecture, were slowly deteriorating under the weight of misfortune, secrecy, and a series of inexplicable tragedies. The earlier generations had survived and documented their afflictions with a mixture of fear and clinical observation, but the cumulative toll of repeated transformations, illness, and social isolation proved devastating. The decline was both biological and social, a convergence of hereditary affliction, superstition, and societal rejection that slowly erased their influence and wealth. The family's isolation, originally a protective measure, became one of the main catalysts for decay. Nobility, by its nature, depended on alliances and marriages to maintain status and power. The whispers surrounding the cursed bloodline made outsiders wary. Many families refused to intermarry with them, fearing the transmission of whatever mysterious malady or curse plagued the household. This led to increasingly insular marriage patterns. Cousins and distant relatives within the same bloodline were preferred. While this preserved estates within the family, it also intensified the likelihood of hereditary illness manifesting, creating a vicious cycle. Fear of contamination fueled inbreeding, which in turn produced more evidence of curse, further isolating the family. Socially, the family's reputation eroded steadily. Villagers, servants, and clergy alike were reluctant to maintain close ties. Outsiders reported seeing strange behaviors, grotesque physical changes, or episodes of apparent possession, reinforcing the perception that the household was unsafe or unholy. Even the most loyal staff either left or were dismissed under mysterious circumstances. Accounts collected decades later describe servants fleeing at night, sometimes leaving belongings behind, terrified of witnessing another transformation. The estate became a ghostly place long before the last of the family line passed away, as if the physical decay of buildings mirrored the erosion of bloodline and reputation. Financial decline accompanied social and biological collapse. Estates were expensive to maintain, and the family's increasingly eccentric behaviors limited their ability to participate in trade or politics. Investments faltered. Management of farms and serfs was neglected. Letters preserved in regional archives hint at the frustration of accountants and distant relatives who tried, and failed, to stabilize the household's wealth. The ledger, once a record of fear and observation, began to double as a record of loss. Deaths, failed heirs, and mismanaged properties were meticulously noted alongside accounts of shapeshifting and physical distortion, as if the two were inextricably linked. The decline of mental stability in successive generations was equally striking. Ledger entries from the 1860s and 1870s show a marked increase in entries documenting episodes of psychosis, delirium, and depression. A young woman, once described as bright and lively, began exhibiting repeated outbursts, insisting that her reflection was another being speaking to her. A boy of 16 began wandering at night, speaking in languages no one recognized and collapsing from exhaustion. These incidents were noted in a tone of quiet resignation. The family seemed to recognize that the curse, or illness, was unstoppable, that they were powerless to intervene. Over time, despair permeated the household. The very act of survival became secondary to the grim record of suffering. By the 1880s, the estate itself began to crumble physically. Roofs leaked, walls cracked, and furnishings decayed. Those who remained described the house as haunted, not merely by spirits, but by memory and expectation. Every creaking floorboard or flicker of candlelight reminded the inhabitants of the transformations, the illnesses, and the shame that had accumulated over decades. The family's isolation, already protective, became suffocating. Few letters or official documents suggest any meaningful contact with the outside world. Even the clergy, who had once attempted intervention, eventually ceased visits, perhaps fearful of contagion, or perhaps recognizing that rational solutions could not penetrate the tangled web of heredity and superstition. The final generation recorded in the ledger demonstrates the culmination of this decline. A boy and girl, the last heirs, were noted as suffering extreme physical and psychological manifestations: pale, fragile, prone to fainting and sudden outbursts. Their parents, increasingly unable to cope, withdrew from public life entirely. At the same time, rumors in neighboring villages shifted from curiosity to horror. Villagers spoke of strange lights in the windows at night, of shadows moving without human form, and of sounds, growls, screams, and whispers that seemed to defy natural explanation. The family had become not merely isolated, but emblematic of the intersection between hereditary illness, superstition, and societal ostracism. The decline was also marked by the dispersal and eventual loss of the ledger itself. Once a secret record of transformations and misfortunes, the ledger had survived decades of concealment, yet by the early 20th century it was nearly lost to history. Renovations, fires, and political upheaval threatened its existence, and only through accidental discovery was it preserved for posterity. Its survival underscores the fragility of memory and the tenacity of fear. The family may have perished, but the ledger allowed their story to endure, ensuring that their afflictions, whether interpreted as disease, curse, or both, would not vanish entirely. Historians studying the decline note a tragic symmetry. As the family's physical and mental health deteriorated, so too did their social and financial standing. Each factor fed the others in a cycle of collapse. Hereditary illness produced odd behaviors alienated the community, isolation intensified illness and despair produced more physical decline. By the time the estate was abandoned, the once mighty bloodline was reduced to scattered, anonymous survivors, and the surrounding countryside whispered only of ghosts, curses, and shape-shifting nobles. The story of decline also highlights a broader theme about human obsession with control. The family attempted to document and thus master their curse, believing that careful recording might reveal patterns or solutions. But the ledger itself became both witness and prisoner, a repository of horrors that could not be mitigated, a mirror reflecting the inescapable nature of the family's affliction. By the end, survival was less about living and more about enduring, living long enough to add another line to the ledger, another evidence of what the bloodline had become. Ultimately, the decline of this Russian family is a study in inevitability. Whether viewed through the lens of genetics, psychology, folklore, or supernatural belief, their trajectory seems preordained once isolation and hereditary affliction set the stage. They survived for decades, yet each generation bore the burden of the past, culminating in a final chapter of decline so complete that the house, the wealth, and the bloodline itself nearly vanished entirely. The surviving ledger remains as a testament to their struggle, a reminder that some legacies cannot be controlled, and that the intersection of biology, belief, and fear can be as haunting as any legend.